Hello everyone and welcome back to Newegg TV. My name is Paul and today's video is all about Intel's newest line of processors. The code name is Ivy Bridge E, and I'm here to give you guys a better explanation of the new processors, what platform they fit with, what sort of performance you might expect from them, as well as the particular use case scenario that might make this an excellent processor for you to use at home, because there's lots of different types of computing that people do out there, and it really helps to do your research beforehand to make sure that whatever processor you're buying is going to be one that will live up to the standards and the uses that you intend to use it for. So to that end, I do have an Ivy Bridge E processor right here. This is an engineering sample. I've also have a couple retail boxes, and these are not necessarily the retail boxes that these processors are going to ship with, but I do have some comparisons to make for you and that sort of thing. But let's talk about Intel's Enthusiast platform, because this has been something that they've been doing for a little while now, and it's kind of an exciting thing, especially for folks who are really into computing, whether you're talking about high-end computing tasks, or whether you're talking about gamers, or whether you're talking about people who just like to have the best and the fastest hardware that they can possibly get. The Enthusiast line from Intel has definitely been where that's at for the past, I don't know, 6-8 years. Starting with the 1366 socket, they upgraded that a couple years ago, or just about 2 years ago, with its socket 2011. Ivy Bridge E is a drop-in solution that will also work with socket 2011. So socket 2011 came out again about 2 years ago, and Sandy Bridge E was the code name of the processors that slotted into that socket. The chipset that launched at the time was called X79, and that's been around for quite some time, about 2 years, and it's been the platform of choice for anyone who's doing something beyond your typical day-to-day computing tasks or beyond gaming. These processors are going to be more suited towards higher-end computing tasks. So if you're doing stuff like video editing and rendering, for example, if you're doing fluid dynamics, if you're doing medical simulations, anything that is really processor-intensive, especially multi-threaded tasks, because this is the only platform from Intel where you can currently get a 6-core processor, and then also thanks to Intel's hyper-threading technology, you can effectively double up the logical threads that the operating system can address, which gives you a total of 12 for most of the processors in this line. Let's take a closer look though, and let's talk about what processors are going to be available at launch. So here's my engineering sample, and this is the flagship of the Ivy Bridge E line of processors. So this is the 4960X. However, there's 3 different processors available at launch. The entry-level processor is the 4820K. Now, all of these processors are going to have a 130-watt TDP, or thermal design power. They're all going to be compatible with Intel's socket 2011 motherboards, so existing X79 socket 2011 motherboards will work with this processor. You just might need a firmware and a UEFI update. So you should definitely double-check your manufacturer's product page for your motherboard to make sure that they're supporting Ivy Bridge before you have it, and also to make sure that you're going about the proper procedures to update the firmware and the UEFI, or also known as BIOS. They also support faster memory, so you get official support for 4-channel DDR3 1866 memory. That's up from 1600 that was available with the original Sandy Bridge E processors. But back to the CPUs that are available at launch for this series. First off, you have the 4820K, which is going to be kind of your entry level. That's a 4-core or quad-core processor, and you get 8 threads via hyper-threading, so 8 addressable threads in the operating system. That's going to have a base frequency of 3.7 gigahertz, and via Intel's Turbo Boost, it can boost itself up to 3.9 gigahertz, and that one also features 10 megabytes of L3 cache. The sort of middle-of-the-road SKU, and that one is going to be the update for the 3930K. That's the 4930K, kind of appropriately. That's a 6-core or hexa-core processor, 12 threads, 3.4 gigahertz base clock on that one, and a 3.9 gigahertz turbo boost. That one ups your L3 cache to 12 megabytes. Finally, you have the big daddy right here, which is the 4960X, also a 6-core or hexa-core, 12 threads on this one. This one has a 3.6 gigahertz base clock and a 4 gigahertz turbo boost, and this one also gives you the maximum amount of cache, which is 15 megabytes. Now, when you're talking about the different microarchitectures that are currently available right now, you actually have about 3 of them. Ivy Bridge has been out for some time. Prior to that, you had Sandy Bridge, and Sandy Bridge E is what Intel originally launched this platform on, so I do have an example of that processor right here. This is the 3970X, and this is probably a little bit more along the lines of what the box is going to look like, at least for your Extreme Edition processor. That's the one with the X on the end. Now, when it comes to Ivy Bridge, as in relation to Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge brought a 22 nanometer manufacturing process, as well as some additional technologies such as 3D transistors that gave you performance improvement of roughly 10 to 15% and power savings as well by way of the shrunk down process. Also, as far as the platform goes, again, LGA 2011 socket motherboards, X79 chipset. Again, existing motherboards might need a new firmware or UEFI update, and you should always check your motherboard manufacturer's site for compatibility listings for that. As far as that, other changes are going to be fairly minimal. This is mainly an architecture change. The processors themselves are going to look roughly the same. They're about the same size, as you can see looking through the back of the box right here. And again, it's a drop-in solution to upgrade if you are planning to upgrade from Sandy Bridge E, or if you simply have an X79 motherboard. Again, make sure it's got those updates so it's going to work properly. And I did want to mention X79 when it comes to the chipset itself, because that's been a chipset that's been out for a couple years, and when it comes to Ivy Bridge E, X79 motherboards are not necessarily getting a chipset upgrade. So you will be working with a little bit of the limitations or perceived limitations when it comes to today's expectations, particularly when you compare it to, say, for example, Intel's Haswell processors, which are currently out on their mainstream platform versus their enthusiast platform, which is supposed to be above that, but there's a bit of give and take there either way. But when it comes to X79 motherboards, what motherboard manufacturers have done is, first off, of course, updated the firmware and the UEFI for compatibility. But a lot of motherboards you'll find, a lot of more motherboard manufacturers, such as Gigabyte, you'll find will have done stuff to the motherboard itself to make to give you some of those higher end capabilities that you might come to expect. For example, the X79 chipset only has 2 native serial ATA revision 3 6 gigabits per second ports. So if you're connecting SSDs, for example, you're going to be limited to that. However, motherboard manufacturers might add on additional chips to provide additional SATA 6 gigabits per second ports. So that's one way that they can improve the functionality of the board as compared to what is available by default with X79. USB 3.0 is another thing that is kind of an expectation when it comes to modern computers. Again, motherboard manufacturers have the option to add a chip onto the motherboard to provide you additional controllers. So this motherboard, for example, from Gigabyte, the X79 UP4, they've added 4 additional USB 3.0 ports to provide you that connectivity, especially if that's something that you are expecting when it comes to building a new computer. So jumping back to a comparison between your Ivy Bridge E and your Sandy Bridge E, because I know that's one big difference that people are going to be interested in. First off, you're just going to get about a 5 to 15% IPC, or instructions per clock, performance improvement. If you're jumping up to Ivy Bridge E versus Sandy Bridge E, that's just a benefit of the improved microarchitecture from Sandy Bridge to Ivy Bridge. The other benefit is that you get unlocked SKUs all the way down the line. So you have the 4820K, as we've already mentioned. That's as compared to the Sandy Bridge E equivalent, which was the 3820, which was not a fully unlocked chip. So it's very nice that Intel has provided fully unlocked chips all the way down to the entry level for this particular platform. Another feature that you haven't heard quite as much about, at least at press time that we're recording this, is you have a feature called per core overclocking. And that's something that is going to be developed over time. It's not something that you'll necessarily be able to take advantage of right off the bat, but you do get the ability to overclock from within your operating system. So for example, from within Windows, you can set up your overclocking parameters, and you can engage those overclocks without requiring your computer to restart. And that also opens up the possibility for software-based overclocking in the future. So for example, you might have software that runs that only needs 2 of the cores. For that software running, you could do a more aggressive overclock on just 2 of the cores. And then if you load up a program, for example, that's going to do heavily multi-threaded video rendering or something like that, then it might engage a different profile that only overclocks the cores more slightly, but it does an overclock on all of your cores. So that's some flexibility that we might be seeing in the future, some additional development on this platform that we're hoping to see from Intel as well as software vendors. And then the other benefit you get is actually a die shrink. When we originally talked about Sandy Bridge E processors, one thing that we were bearing in mind was that Sandy Bridge E is actually kind of a throwdown from the Xeon platform. So Sandy Bridge E chips actually had 8 cores in them. Just 2 of those cores were disabled. By designing the processors with 6 cores rather than with 8 cores and 2 of them disabled, they were able to shrink the die down significantly. You actually have a 257 square millimeter die with the Ivy Bridge E versus 435 square millimeter die with Sandy Bridge E. So that actually leads to some increased efficiency. You're going to see about 20% less power used by the Ivy Bridge E chips, and that's going to depend, of course, on which applications you're running and what type of environment you're in. But those are some of the differences from Sandy Bridge E to Ivy Bridge E. So clearly, if you jump up to Ivy Bridge E from Sandy Bridge E, it's going to be a faster and more efficient processor. However, there is another contender in the ring, and that would be Haswell. We've got a 4770K from the Haswell microarchitecture right here. Now, Haswell is Intel's mainstream line, and they've been continuing that along with their enthusiast line. And if you're looking at Haswell, it contains a newer microarchitecture. So there's some features here that are definitely in competition with Ivy Bridge E. But again, this comes back to that point where any computer that you're going to be building, for example, is going to be a computer that you want to build for a specific use case scenario. So Ivy Bridge E is really designed for workstation use. So unless you're doing high-end computing tasks, unless you're doing heavily multi-threaded tasks, if you're doing video rendering, again, if you're doing fluid dynamics, you're doing massive simulations, you're doing anything that you know is actually going to take advantage of additional cores. If you use your computer for work and rendering a project is something that if you could cut 20% of that time off, you can send that project out that much sooner and it will lead to more money in your pocket. That's definitely a great example of why you might want to go with the enthusiast platform. This is really more towards a workstation thing, and Haswell is still an excellent option for anyone who's looking to build a system. If you're looking to do, say, just gaming and computer browsing, kind of your standard at-home computer usage. So bear in mind when you're choosing your processor that different processors are more adept at different things, and Ivy Bridge E is definitely going to be more adept at tasks that you're not going to see quite as common in at-home computer use. So Haswell is definitely still out there and definitely still a very viable option, particularly if you're just looking at building a gaming or web browsing machine. But that's going to wrap it up for this sort of overview and introduction for Intel's new line of Ivy Bridge E processors. Again, they will slot into Intel's Socket 2011 motherboards with the X79 chipset. Just double check your motherboard manufacturer's website to see if they have the proper firmware and UEFI update to get that board working with the new Ivy Bridge E processors. I'm Paul with Newegg TV. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, go ahead and click that like button right down there, and we'll see you all next time on Newegg TV.